Nicolas Puech never sought the limelight. As an heir to the Hermès fortune, he lived in the rarefied world of European aristocracy, an existence defined by discretion, wealth, and legacy. He was born into one of the most powerful families in France, the great-grandson of Thierry Hermès, the man who founded the iconic luxury brand that would one day become synonymous with elegance and exclusivity. Despite his vast wealth, Puech remained an enigmatic figure, shunning public appearances and media attention. Unlike the modern-day billionaires who flaunted their riches, he preferred a life of seclusion, residing in a sprawling estate in Switzerland. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail, a trait perhaps inherited from his family's long-standing tradition of craftsmanship. Hermès, the company that had built his fortune, was not just another luxury brand. It was an empire, fiercely protected by its founding family. The Puechs and their relatives controlled the company with an iron grip, ensuring that outside forces, especially corporate raiders, could never seize control. The family had successfully fended off a takeover attempt by LVMH in the early 2000s, cementing their legacy as guardians of a fashion dynasty. But behind the gilded doors of this empire, family tensions simmered. While other heirs actively participated in the business, Puech distanced himself. He had once served on Hermès's supervisory board, but in 2014, he abruptly resigned. He was never seen at board meetings again, and whispers of a falling out with other family members began to circulate. Some said he had grown disillusioned with the internal politics. Others speculated that he simply wanted to retreat into his own world. Though he severed ties with Hermès decision-making, he still held a staggering 5.7% of the company's shares, a fortune worth billions. It was an amount large enough to sway corporate decisions, but Puech never wielded that power. Instead, he entrusted his financial affairs to a trusted Swiss financial advisor, Eric Freimond. Freimond was a well-known figure in Switzerland's elite banking circles. He had managed the wealth of numerous high-profile clients, handling vast sums with precision and secrecy. For over 2 decades, he had been the gatekeeper of Puech's fortune, making investments, overseeing bank accounts, and ensuring that the heir's wealth remained untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But by 2024, something had changed. At first, it was just an uneasy feeling, a vague sense that something was amiss. Puech had long taken a hands-off approach to his financial matters, trusting Freimond implicitly. But when he casually inquired about the status of his Hermès shares, the answer he received shook him to his core. They were gone. All of them. The 6 million shares, worth approximately $13 billion, had vanished without a trace. Puech felt the world tilt beneath him. His entire fortune, built over generations, had disappeared. How? Where? And more importantly, who was responsible? At first, he tried to stay calm. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a clerical error at the bank. But the more he dug, the more disturbing the reality became. The wealth that had been his birthright, the empire that had been carefully guarded for nearly 2 centuries, was no longer his. Someone had stolen it. And now, Nicolas Puech, the man who had spent his life avoiding drama and scandal, was about to find himself at the center of one of the most shocking financial mysteries in modern history. Nicolas Puech had always been a man of control over his life, his privacy, and, most importantly, his wealth. But as he sat in his study that cold January morning in 2024, staring at the banking documents spread across his desk, a terrible realization sank in. His fortune was gone. It wasn't just a case of misplaced numbers or a temporary oversight. The Hermès shares, the same shares that had made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe, no longer belonged to him. There was no record of a sale he had approved, no transaction that he had authorized. It was as if his $13 billion fortune had been wiped from existence. His hands trembled as he reached for the phone. His first call was to the Swiss bank that had managed his assets. The response was frustratingly vague. "Mr. Puech, according to our records, your shares were transferred months ago. The details are all in your financial reports." "Transferred? To whom?" A pause. "Sir, the transactions were executed under the financial mandates you signed. We assumed you were aware of them." Puech's mind reeled. He had signed no such orders. He had never intended to sell his Hermes shares. There was only one man who had access to those documents, one man who had managed his accounts for decades. Eric Fremond. For years, Fremond had been more than just a financial advisor. He had been a confidant, someone Puech relied on to navigate the complexities of wealth management. The two men had shared a quiet understanding. Puech had no interest in watching stock markets or attending business meetings, and Fremond ensured that his fortune remained intact. Now everything pointed to betrayal. Puech wasted no time. Within hours, his legal team was mobilized. Lawyers combed through contracts, tracing the flow of money. They found something that sent a chill down his spine. The shares had been sold in increments over the past year. Not all at once, but piece by piece, quietly liquidated in a manner that ensured no sudden alarms were raised. Worse still, the transactions had been done through bearer shares, a type of financial instrument that allowed ownership to change hands without any official record of the buyer. That meant one thing: tracing the missing billions would be nearly impossible. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Puech felt powerless. But he wasn't going down without a fight. That evening, under the glow of his study's antique chandelier, Puech made a final decision. He was filing a criminal complaint against Eric Fremond. The legal battle began swiftly. Geneva's courts received his lawsuit, in which he accused Fremond of orchestrating a gigantic fraud, a betrayal that had cost him his fortune. The case sent shockwaves through Swiss financial circles. At first, Fremond remained silent, but within days he responded publicly. And his response was devastating. Instead of outright denying the accusations, Fremond made a claim of his own. "Mr. Puech's allegations are not only false, but they are also an elaborate attempt to avoid inheritance taxes. The truth is, he is planning to leave his fortune to an employee, and now he is using this fabricated scandal to justify moving his assets." The accusations stunned Puech. He had always been a private man, but now his personal affairs were being dragged into the public eye. And worse, some parts of what Fremond said were true. Because Nicholas Puech had been making plans to do something unprecedented. He was preparing to leave his fortune, not to his family, nor to a foundation, but to someone completely unexpected. The headlines exploded overnight. Billionaire heir claims fortune stolen, but is it a tax dodge? Hermes tycoon accuses advisor of fraud, but his own plans raise questions. Where did Nicholas Puech's billions go? The world was watching, but Nicholas Puech wasn't concerned about public opinion. He had spent his life avoiding the media, and if not for this catastrophe, he would have remained an anonymous billionaire. But now he had been dragged into the spotlight, accused of attempting to cheat the system. And all because of one truth: he had planned to leave his fortune to his former gardener. For decades, Puech had been known as a man of strict discipline, cold, distant, reserved. He never married, had no children, and distanced himself from most of his extended family. He had no heirs in the traditional sense, but there was one person in his life who had earned his trust in a way few others had: Abderrazak Jadil Boutrak. For years, Boutrak had worked for Puech as a gardener on his Swiss estate. Their relationship had begun as that of employer and employee, but over time, something changed. Boutrak wasn't just another staff member. He became a trusted companion, a confidant. He and his partner, Maria Paz Pinero, had been loyal to Puech in ways his own family never had. As the years passed, Puech made an extraordinary decision. He would legally adopt Boutrak, making him his heir. His reasoning was twofold. First, he had no desire for his fortune to be swallowed by the Hermès dynasty, a family he had grown estranged from. Second, under Swiss law, adoption would allow Boutrak to inherit his wealth while significantly reducing the taxes that would have been imposed on a non-relative. But that decision had consequences. News of the planned adoption had leaked within private circles. Some in the Hermès family saw it as an act of defiance, a deliberate move to keep billions out of their hands. Others suspected manipulation. Was Boutrak truly a loyal friend? Or was he positioning himself as the sole heir to one of the greatest fortunes in France? And then there was Eric Frémond's accusation. If Puech had been planning to give his money away, why would he accuse his financial advisor of theft? Was this a desperate strategy to hide assets? The court battle in Geneva intensified. Puech's legal team worked tirelessly to prove that his shares had been stolen, while Frémond's lawyers countered with their own explosive claims. Documents were produced, transactions examined. Puech was forced to sit in courtrooms for the first time in his life, facing questions he had never anticipated answering in public. Mr. Puech, did you or did you not approve the liquidation of your shares? Absolutely not. And yet the documents bear your signature. A shiver ran down his spine. His signature? He knew he had never signed away his billions. But what if... forgery. Could it be? He turned to his lawyers. If his signature had been used without his consent, it meant something far worse than simple fraud. It meant his most trusted advisor had been plotting against him for years, laying the groundwork for this moment. But Frémond wasn't done. The financial advisor took the stand himself, his voice calm, measured. He didn't just deny the accusations. He painted Puech as a man who had lost his grip on reality. This is a man in decline. He is not thinking clearly. He is being manipulated by those around him, and he is lashing out at those who have always acted in his best interest. The statement sent ripples through the courtroom. Was Frémond telling the truth? Had Puech, in his old age, become paranoid? Was this truly a theft? Or was it the desperate act of a man who no longer trusted even his own memory? Or worse, was someone else pulling the strings? As the trial dragged on, a new, chilling thought entered Puech's mind. What if this wasn't just about missing money? What if this was something deeper, something planned for years? And if so, who was really behind it? Nicolas Puech sat in his study, staring at the flickering candlelight, his mind spiraling with doubt. For the first time in his life, he was no longer certain of anything. The man he had trusted for decades, Eric Frémond, stood in a Geneva courtroom, calmly asserting that Puech was a delusional old man, manipulated by his own chosen heir. The courts were listening. The media was listening. And worst of all, so was his own family. The legal battle took a dark turn when forensic accountants began tracing the money trail. If Frémond had orchestrated a fraud, there had to be a pattern, a hidden structure within the transactions. At first, it was a dead end. The shares had been sold gradually, methodically, using bearer shares, a financial instrument so discreet that ownership changed hands with a simple transfer, leaving behind no record of who now controlled the billions. But then, a discovery, a single wire transfer. Buried in the financial reports was a large sum, an amount suspiciously close to the value of the first batch of Hermès shares that had been liquidated. It had moved through a complex web of offshore accounts, disappearing into the ether. But before it vanished completely, it landed briefly in an account belonging to an entity Puech had never heard of. A private trust based in the Cayman Islands, a trust controlled by members of his own family. Puech's heart pounded. Was this an external fraud? Or had the theft been an inside job all along? The Hermes family had always been a fortress. It had survived economic downturns, corporate takeovers, and internal disputes. The reason was simple: absolute control. But Puech had always been the outlier. He had left the supervisory board years ago. He had no direct say in how the family business was run. And now he was threatening to give his wealth away to a former gardener instead of keeping it within the dynasty. Would they have stood by and let that happen? Or had someone within the family decided to act first? The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. If his own relatives were involved, it meant this wasn't just financial fraud. It was a calculated coup. His lawyers urged caution. "Mr. Puech, we need to be sure before we make an accusation against your family. We have only one transfer. It's not enough." "Then find me more." For weeks, his legal team worked behind the scenes, unraveling the maze of offshore transactions. The more they dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Other accounts, other transfers, all leading back to a small group of key figures within the Hermes family. Somehow, over the years, they had gained influence over his assets without his knowledge. But there was one critical question left unanswered. Had Fremond been working for them? If he had, it would explain everything: the systematic sale of the shares, the calculated discrediting of Puech's mental state, the fabricated story about inheritance tax fraud. But if he hadn't, then Fremond himself had been played, which meant that someone even more powerful was pulling the strings. Puech clenched his fists. The answer was within reach. He had spent his life avoiding confrontation, but now he was ready for war. The next move would be his, and he would find out who had stolen his fortune, no matter the cost. Nicolas Puech had spent his life avoiding conflict. He had stepped away from Hermes's internal politics, relinquished his role in the family empire, and chosen the quiet solitude of his Swiss estate over boardroom battles. But now he was at war. For weeks, his lawyers had unearthed a sinister pattern of transactions: money shifting through offshore accounts, disappearing into the shadows, and reappearing under the control of Hermes family members. At the heart of it all was a single question: had his own blood betrayed him? Or had they simply seen him as an obstacle to be removed? The court case had already become a media spectacle. Reporters dissected every detail, speculating on who was lying, who was manipulating whom. On one side, Puech, the reclusive billionaire, claiming that his entire fortune had been stolen from beneath him. On the other, his longtime advisor, Eric Fremond, dismissing the allegations as paranoia from an aging man trying to escape taxes. But now, Puech had something new: proof. His legal team presented their findings: a trail of hidden transactions linked to a Cayman Islands trust, controlled by certain Hermes family members. Evidence that Fremond had been involved in the movement of these funds, but only as a middleman, not the mastermind. A confidential internal Hermes memo, suggesting discussions had taken place about ensuring Puech's wealth, remained within the family. The courtroom erupted. For the first time, Puech wasn't just the accuser. He was the victim of a family conspiracy. But the revelations weren't over yet. In a shocking turn, Puech's lawyers called Fremond himself to the stand. When Eric Fremond entered the courtroom, he looked nothing like the composed financier who had once managed billions. He was pale, exhausted, and rattled. Puech watched him closely, studying his face for any sign of guilt. And then came the question that changed everything. "Mr. Fremond, did you orchestrate the theft of Mr. Puech's fortune?" A long silence. Then, to the shock of everyone, Fremond sighed and spoke. "No, I did not, but I was used." A ripple of gasps spread through the room. "By whom?" the lawyer pressed. Fremond hesitated. Then he glanced towards the Hermes family members in attendance before finally answering, "By people with far more power than me." For the first time, Eric Frymon cracked. He confessed that he had followed orders, believing that the transactions were legitimate, that he had been pressured into managing the gradual liquidation of shares, under the impression that Puech himself had authorized it. "They told me it was to protect the legacy of Hermes, that Mr. Puech was unpredictable, that he would give his fortune away to outsiders, that he had to be managed." Puech felt his blood turn cold. This wasn't about fraud. It was about control. His own family had decided that he couldn't be trusted with his own wealth, so they had taken it from him, and they had used Fremont as a tool to do it. Puech clenched his fists under the table. For decades, he had been a quiet figure, detached from the power struggles of his family. He had walked away from the corporate battles, choosing solitude over conflict. But they had mistaken his silence for weakness. They had taken his fortune, believing he wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. This was no longer just about retrieving his lost billions. This was about revenge. And Nicolas Puech was about to turn the tables on them all. For the first time in his life, Nicolas Puech wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was leading the charge. His case had exposed a conspiracy that reached deep into the Hermes family itself. His fortune had been stolen not by a single fraudster, but by his own relatives, who saw him as a liability. And now, the world knew the truth. The Geneva courtroom was silent as Puech's lawyers presented their final arguments. The transactions were clear. His shares had been secretly sold, funneled through offshore accounts controlled by key Hermes family members. The motive was undeniable. His family had moved against him, fearing that his decision to leave his fortune to his former gardener, Abderrazak Jadil Boutrak, would tarnish their legacy. The betrayal was personal. Eric Frymond, once thought to be the mastermind, had been nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger game. Puech sat still, listening as the prosecution dismantled the carefully crafted lies that had been used to strip him of his wealth. For decades, he had let others decide his fate. But now, he was the one in control. The court ruled in Puech's favor. The bearer shares loophole, which had allowed the wealth to vanish without a trace, was no longer an excuse. The financial records proved beyond doubt that his family had orchestrated the scheme, convincing Fremont to act on their behalf. But what came next shocked even Puech. Rather than just returning his fortune, the Swiss courts froze the assets of multiple Hermes family members while a deeper investigation was launched. The family that had once prided itself on absolute secrecy was now under public scrutiny. Hermes, the empire they had fought to protect, was now at the center of a global scandal. With the legal battle won, Puech had a choice to make. He could reclaim his billions, retreat back into his quiet life, and let the wounds heal. Or he could strike back. And he chose war. Instead of restoring his shares and rejoining the Hermes dynasty, Puech did the unthinkable. He followed through on his promise. He adopted Abderrazak Jadil Boutrak, legally making him his son and heir. And then, in a final act of defiance, he began transferring his recovered fortune into an independent trust, outside of the family's control. The very thing his relatives had tried to prevent was now happening before their eyes. The Hermes family had miscalculated. They thought Puech was weak, that he would accept the theft of his fortune quietly, that he would crumble under public doubt and legal pressure. Instead, he exposed them. The scandal rocked the luxury industry. Investors in Hermes panicked. The company's reputation, built on exclusivity and prestige, was now tangled in accusations of internal betrayal. Puech, once the quiet heir, had now become the ultimate disruptor. And as he watched the fallout unfold from his Swiss estate, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just another Hermes heir, he was his own man. And the fortune they had tried to steal? It was still his. But now, he would decide exactly what to do with it.